On Confirmation Day and on a day when we hear a story about Paul and how his life is radically transformed by his encounter with Christ, I have to often, or I do, think of my own personal faith journey and story. I don't think of preaching as telling my own story. I think it's much bigger than that. But I am convinced that if this faith stuff, this Jesus stuff, doesn't mean something to us personally, we're really missing something big. Now, I didn't have an experience like Paul did, an experience where one day the light sort of came on. Jesus was always a part of my life, due not so much to my great efforts, but to my parents and the church youth group that I was a part of, and the pastors I knew, and the great people who made up a community known as Trinity Lutheran in Mount Healthy, Ohio. These folks nurtured in me a fascination with Jesus, a sense that life is much richer, much fuller when it's connected to Him and to His people, the church. I don't think I was a Jesus freak, but almost, I suspect. Joseph Sittler says there's a haunting allure about Jesus. There's something about Him that draws us to Him, something that we have a hard time getting away from, something that sometimes hunts us down and even haunts us. That was Saul, or Paul's experience, his same name, same person. Now, what we have in Acts today is not at all autobiographical. Paul's not telling us his own story. If he were, he'd probably tell it in a very different way. If you read the book of Galatians, he does tell it in a very different way. The storyteller today is Luke, and Luke is quite fanciful in the way he tells stories. He's known for adding flourishes to the stories he tells, special effects and lights and sounds and strong winds and wild cosmic occurrences. If special effects are what you like in movies, then the Gospel of Luke is your gospel. In this story, out of Acts, Luke part 2. In this story, we get these special effects, blinding lights, voices from some other dimension. And we also get a glimpse into the effect of Jesus on Paul's personal life, into what happened to Paul personally when the risen Christ appeared to him, a glimpse into the way I think that Jesus haunted him. What the story tells us is that Paul is on his way to Damascus to find some Christian Jews, people of the way they were known at the time, so that he might persecute them. He wants to rid his religion of these Reformed Jewish folks who are bringing change to his religion. And while he's on his way to that place to do the awful thing he's about ready to do, the risen Christ appears to him, changing him and changing all his plans. You see, this is what happens when you meet the risen Christ. Whether you've grown up with him or he becomes a part of your life at a later point, he changes you. He haunts you. You can't be the same again. Life enters your darkness. Sometimes that light is too much to bear. Sometimes it is so powerful that it knocks us or others on the ground, unsettling our settled worlds. Now again, for me, it didn't occur like that as it did for Paul. The light didn't just come on one day. But like Paul, I have experienced the risen Christ unsettling my settled world. I thought I had it all figured out many times in my life. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I had people all figured out. I really did. And I thought at times in my life I knew what was best for everybody. I grew up in order, some people might call it. I'm phenomenally grateful for that, by the way. Some of the healthiest people, and parents remember this, some of the healthiest people are those who start with a strong sense of order. But the encounter with the risen Christ has disordered my life over and over again. Now, note how that disordering initially occurred to Paul. When the light overwhelms him and he falls to the ground, he hears a voice that says to him, Saul, Saul, Paul, Paul, why do you persecute me? The first thing to recognize, and this is really important, confirmation students, the first thing to recognize here is that the voice of the risen Christ is that which knows Paul, knows him by name. Saul, Saul, Paul, Paul. We got to get this. What is after you and what is after me is not that which communicates to you that you don't matter, that you don't count in a world of billions of people. What is after you is a love that knows you and names you. Matthew, Colden, Addison, you are known by God. You matter deeply to God and frankly to all of us. That's the truth of baptism, by the way. In baptism, we are named. We are named children of God. What is after you and will be after you forever is love. Love that treasures you. Love that knows you. Love that names you. Now, I'm intrigued by what else the risen Christ says to Saul or Paul. After he names him, he asks this question, why do you persecute me? Me? Why do you persecute me? Paul is persecuting followers of the way, early Christians. And the risen Christ says that he is persecuting him. Christ. The way we treat other people is the way we treat Christ. The Gospel of Matthew says the same thing when Jesus claims that when you do it to the least of these, my brothers or sisters, you do it to me, Jesus. Our treatment of other people is no small matter. Our violence directed toward other people is no insignificant issue. To love Jesus is to love people, and to love people is to love Jesus. That is the way of Jesus. Now, whenever I have forgotten this, whenever I am prone to allow my hard-heartedness not to forgive, whenever I am tempted to dismiss people for whatever reason, I find that I am haunted by the risen Christ, who always seems to be leading me beyond where I naturally want to go, always sending me out beyond my comfortable, well-defined, settled world. You know, in many ways, the story that we often call Paul's conversion is really not about his conversion. It's about his call, about his commissioning. Ananias, the man selected to bring healing and care to Paul, is told to do so because Paul has been selected to bring the name of Christ to the Gentiles. That means everybody. God's got work for Paul to do, big work. Now, it's no surprise, by the way, that Ananias protests. I'm supposed to go to this guy, this hating, persecuting guy? Are you crazy? Well, this is what happens when you meet the risen Christ. Your expectations are shattered. You are overwhelmed by what God will do with broken, sinful people. You will have to take a second look at everybody. You will not be able to dismiss anyone. Now, just between a couple of us, I'm not there yet. Vladimir Putin is still on my dismissal list, and I don't expect him to be leaving that list anytime soon. But I hear the call nonetheless. Ananias hears the call. He does what he is told. He goes the straight street and meets up with Paul and brings him healing, enables him to see again, and frees him to begin the work that he has been called to do. And before I talk about this work, though, I do want to note this. I want to note what both Paul and Ananias experience with the risen Christ. Both are just told what to do. Paul, get up and go. Ananias, go to Paul. There isn't any kind of negotiating. You know, I just don't feel like going today. I don't feel like taking the trash out today. I just don't feel like it. All what we hear is go. Now, I know this isn't popular these days, but sometimes we just got to be prepared to do what we're told to do. And now the parents are giving me a standing ovation with that line, but it's true not just for kids, it's true for everybody. Life in the way, life led by the risen Christ isn't always about our personal wants, personal rights, personal needs. Sometimes we just got to do what needs to be done. By the way, for the sake of the community. It stinks when the garbage isn't taken out. Don't get me wrong. There are times when you shouldn't do things that people tell you what to do, tell you to do. Needy and bossy people shouldn't control our lives. But life in the way of Jesus isn't about always our own leading. Sometimes we need to be led. Paul was led. He was led by the risen Christ and by Ananias. Being led initially meant that he was blinded, but then it also meant afterward that his sight was restored. Something like scales fell from his eyes, we're told. Being led meant that he was given something meaningful and life-transforming to do with his life. Because Ananias and Paul were led and they followed, Paul became a missionary. He became the greatest promoter of the way of Jesus probably in all of history. In many ways, Paul changed the world, not because he listened simply to what his feelings and thoughts were. He was led, and he gave in. Now, to meet the risen Christ is not only to be personally changed. It is to be given something to do. It is to be sent on a mission. And I have to tell you, that awareness has haunted me about the risen Christ as I have aged. As I've moved beyond the early years of my faith life that involved a fascination with Jesus. The risen Christ tells Ananias that he himself will show Paul how much he must suffer for the sake of his name. To know that you have something to do, that you are invited into a big mission, means realizing that life won't always be about you, that you will have bigger and harder things tugging on your life and at your soul, that you might even have to suffer. In the confirmation rite that we'll experience in just a few seconds, our confirmation students are going to be asked what I think is a very deep and heavy question. If they intend to serve all people, following the example of Jesus, and to strive for justice and peace in all of the earth. We're not only telling you folks that you are loved and that you are treasured, but we are telling you you've got something to do, something big to do. You're going to be asked if you're willing to participate in the mission of Christ, the mission of God. And I know as well as you do, these are tough days to be asked that question. These are days of war, horrible war. These are days when the earth and all that is facing unprecedented challenge as the climate warms. These are days of sickness and too much death. These are days of school violence, too much drug and alcohol addiction. These are days of family disintegration. That's our mission field, folks. The risen Christ haunts us. And I know you who are young, it's hard to get this. I'm just preparing you for this. The risen Christ haunts us until we enter the pain of the world. Now that sounds hard, and it is. But I dare you to ask Paul, do you wish you hadn't been visited by the risen Christ? I think he'd say, heck no. And I would tell you this, and I've spent 30 years entering in the pain of the world, of the local world here. If he were to say, do you wish he hadn't visited you and taken you to those harder and deeper places? Then I'd say, heck no. Entering the suffering of the world is not easy, but being led by the risen Christ brings a life that is so filled with life that I would not want to be any place else. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. And wow, the life that is our gift, because we're haunted by the alive, living Lord who names you, claims you, who won't let you go, and who has some remarkably good life, world-altering work for you to do.